Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Fears for community safety yet again, with a 16-year-old boy stabbing a member of the public before being shot dead by police. Now, we know he's had 2 years in a de-radicalisation program, so it's time we had a serious conversation about just how effective or not these programs really are. Speaking of community safety, a shock poll out today showing just how much the issue's cut through, with voters saying that Labor's under serious pressure here. Dennis Shanahan with more. Plus, a bit later in the show, we'll cross live to London for an update on their big weekend of mayoralty elections. Will they spell disaster for Rishi Sunak's Tory government? What's more, real concerns now for Britain as a number of pro-Palestinian candidates were voted in. And you know you've got problems when ministers are contradicting the Prime Minister. Clare O'Neil today forced to admit that the Detainee Review Board isn't really independent. Only that's not what the Prime Minister was saying last week.
And the Prime Minister has presided over a process now where he's delegated his responsibility to keep Australians safe to some unelected body, and then he blames them when they make the wrong decision. Well, Prime Minister, the buck stops with you. If Minister Giles is not up to the task, sack him. If Minister O'Neill is not up to the task, sack her.
But first, when can a terrorist event not actually be called a terrorist event? When it seems it has all the hallmarks of a terrorist event, in the words of the West Australian Police Commissioner, but when authorities are under pressure in these politically correct times to not call it what it actually is. Whilst it meets the criteria, or at least the definition of a terrorism event, said Commissioner Blanche, that's something we can work towards as we find out more information from the motivations behind this. Now, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that police are avoiding calling it a terrorist event because they'd rather not have 2 alleged Islamist terror stabbings in Australia in just 3 weeks. So in order to avoid accusations of Islamophobia, things aren't being called what they really are. Even if, in this case, as in the stabbing of Bishop Emmanuel, it's the alleged motivating ideology of Islamist extremism that lies at the heart of what we are witnessing. Because, as reported today, the youth who stabbed a man in a Bunnings car park in Perth over the weekend, before being then shot dead by police, had been identified as at risk of Islamist extremism and had in fact been enrolled in a de-radicalisation program for the past 2 years. As well, before his would-be rampage, he messaged contacts saying, and I quote, "I'm going on the path of jihad tonight for the sake of Allah. I'm a soldier of the Mujahideen of Al-Qaeda," he reportedly messaged, "and take responsibility for actions that will, inshallah, take place tonight." And while this young man may have been acting alone in this instance, and while he may also have had mental health issues, it's also been reported that there'd been growing concerns within his school community about the disturbing behaviour of a cohort of boys. Now, one boy in this group had reportedly taken a homemade bomb to the school that went off and damaged a toilet block. The WA Police Commissioner said that the dead youth was one of 3 or 4, he said, of under 18s in the de-radicalisation program. But still, he reckons it would be premature to call this a terrorist event. Now, that's a big inconsistency with the view of New South Wales Police, who had no difficulty declaring the April 15 attack on Bishop Emmanuel as a terrorist event almost as soon as it happened. Now, why this sudden squeamishness about calling an Islamist stabbing a terror event, if that's what it is? A clue might be concerns reported today that the teens' radicalisation would be held against Muslim faith leaders, even though, quote, they stood against extremism. But that's the whole point, isn't it? Very few Muslim leaders have actually stood against extremism. I mean, how many imams have denounced the Hamas butchery of innocents on October 7 rather than make excuses for it? How many imams have denounced the hate preaching against Jews and other non-Muslim believers that routinely occurs in mosques in Sydney and Melbourne and online? Well, very, very few. That's how many. Yesterday, a Perth imam said, and I quote, "There's no place for violence in Islam," before saying that it was, quote, extremely concerned he was about Islamophobia. He said, quote, "Our religion literally means peace." Well, actually, it actually means submission. It's only after the submission we're told there's peace. Over the weekend, Education Minister Jason Clare tried to deny that the pro-Palestinian slogan, "From the river to the sea," couldn't possibly mean the eradication of Israel that it most certainly does.
I've seen people say that those words mean the annihilation of Israel. I've seen people say that it means the opposite. I've seen people say that they're slogans that Israeli political parties have used here.
Well, today the Prime Minister was forced to rebuke his minister.
It is a slogan that calls for opposition to a two-state solution.
Over and over again, the PM says, there's no place in Australia for violent extremism. Sure, but where's the violence in the name of Christianity, or Judaism or Buddhism? There's only one religion that's motivating violent extremism in Australia, and that's Islam. And we make a bad situation worse by pretending otherwise. Today, the PM tried to make violent extremism a social media problem, as if it's Facebook that's causing the violence.
One of the themes of a range of issues lately involves these things. Social media, where people can be pushed through the use of algorithms of what occurs towards more extreme positions.
Look, sure, ideally, hate speech would be purged from social media. But social media is just the vehicle. It's not the cause. The cause is any religion that practices death to the infidel or death to anyone who doesn't believe in its creed. And that's what the Prime Minister needs to stand against, because it doesn't matter if the knife is wielded by a 16-year-old or a 60-year-old, the damage to the victim is the same. And look, hardly a day passes without the debacle deepening over those released foreign criminals. Today we learn another released detainee, Mohammed Alawad, has been bailed 4 times by courts in Melbourne, despite not only breaching his visa conditions, but also for allegedly assaulting a police officer, possessing a dangerous weapon and theft. Now, at least in this case, the Commonwealth opposed bail, albeit they weren't successful. But also today, the Prime Minister's great claim last week that the Community Protection Board that was involved in granting bail to these offenders or removing their ankle monitoring, as happened in the case of the Perth grandmother, Nanette Simon's alleged attacker. Well, that claim from the Prime Minister that it was somehow independent of government, well, that was shown up to be the lie we always knew it was. Here's the Prime Minister last week.
They make their decisions independent. Well, they make the decisions independent. One of the things that we have in this country is a separation there.
The Community Protection Board is, of course, a board that's independent of politicians. It's not appropriate for me to comment on individual cases.
What a fraud. As I wrote in my column in the Sunday papers yesterday, I mean, that comment from the Prime Minister is a lie. Anthony Albanese doesn't even know his own legislation. The board can only make a recommendation, and then that recommendation must be approved or rejected by the minister or the minister's delegate. Today, Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil, well, she was forced to concede on ABC Radio that my reading of the law was right.
It is a part of the government, but it's a group of experts who are making decisions and recommendations to a delegate within the Home Affairs Department. And so, you know, it's not independent in the sense that it's not a separate structure from government, but we must be able to show that we are making good decisions based on the advice of experts, and that's why the Community Protection Board exists.
As O'Neil admitted there, all this body does is make recommendations, after which the minister or the minister's delegate makes the actual decision, meaning it's the government's fault that none of these allegedly dangerous criminals are back behind bars. And as we learned on Friday, Immigration Minister Andrew Giles is so lacking in competence that even the big decisions on bail and the monitoring of these criminals, well, he's handballing that off to bureaucrats to make the call. A ministerial crisis, said one Labor insider today. I don't think that even comes close. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
A day after announcing it will wipe $3 billion worth of student debt, the government announcing more help for university and TAFE students. Thousands of trainee teachers, nurses and social workers will be paid around $320 a week. It will help with costs during their work placements from July next year.
And this is practical help to help people to do the practical part of their degree.
Meanwhile, the Treasurer is trying to downplay expectations ahead of the budget. Revenue upgrades from commodities will land at around $25 billion over 4 years, but that's much lower than we've seen in the last few budgets. A surplus is still expected for this financial year, but deficits will grow in the out years due to ballooning spending pressures.
This is not the time to slash and burn in the budget.
A big spending budget over the forwards is going to be inflationary. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
The pre-budget sales pitch risks being overshadowed by the detainee debacle. The Home Affairs Minister has conceded the Community Protection Board, which ticks off on removing ankle bracelets and curfews for free detainees, is not completely independent, appearing to contradict this from the Prime Minister last week.
Well, the Community Protection Board is, of course, a board that's independent of politicians.
Is it independent?
Well, it is a part of the government, but it's a group of experts who are making decisions and recommendations to a delegate within the Home Affairs Department.
Last week, it was revealed the board ticked off on removing the ankle bracelet of one of the men accused of bashing Perth grandmother Nanette Simons. The PM said last week he disagreed with that decision. Today, he says it was made at arm's length because the Immigration Minister had delegated his decision-making power to an unnamed official.
It's not up to the Minister to make the final decision?
I stand by that. People have delegates across a range of areas.
And Qantas to cough up $120 million to settle the so-called ghost flights case with the ACCC. 87,000 customers on cancelled flights will receive up to $450 of compensation after the airline accepted it misled travellers.
This was egregious and unacceptable conduct by Qantas.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, I'll shortly be joined by Senator James Patterson. He's the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs on all of that detainee stuff today. I'll come back to that in a moment, but now I'm joined by National Editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan, on plenty of other things, including crime. And this poll today in The Australian that read ALP facing voter backlash ahead of the 2025 election. This is a shocker for Labor, Dennis. It comes off the back of a poll that found 73% of Australians believe penalties for youth crime are too soft. In Queensland, it's even worse. 86% of voters up there say crime penalties are too soft when it comes to young people. And you've got Queensland bailed offenders. These are young Queenslanders have breached bail more than 9,000 times. That's the tally in a single year, despite what Miles says is a zero tolerance approach. Now, this is the first time in a long time we've had crime ranked so highly on one of these polls. The only things that pip it, cost of living, housing affordability, we would expect that. But this is cutting through. It's cutting through at a national level, of course, with the detainee mess and the imagery, I think, of Nanette Simons last week. I think that's very powerful out of Perth, but it's also hurting Labor at a state level. I think the brand now, Dennis, the brand of Labor is really suffering.
Well, this has been a very sharp rise in the attitude to crime and violent crime. It's the first time I've seen where crime nationally has rated above the cost of living and various other issues. This is what people are seeing on a daily basis. Now, obviously, there have been some incredibly daunting, shocking developments in the last few weeks which have really grabbed people's attention. But this has been a very long build, particularly for the federal government. Normally, it's state governments that carry the weight of crime, and of course this has been the case in Queensland in the build towards the state election. But nationally, the Labor government is beginning to suffer from long-held problems in the Northern Territory, particularly Alice Springs, then in Queensland, in home invasions in Victoria, and of course, Nanette Simons has become the face of violent crime from released detainees, immigration detainees. It has all melded together. It has become a national problem and one that has picked up on individual state problems. Anthony Albanese faces a real problem here because immigration detainees who have been released are being wound in to what has been a shocking series of crimes, public crimes, and people are frightened. And coming at a time when they feel pressured by a cost of living, of course, when they see social cohesion falling apart, they see violent crime, it makes them even more worried. And this is now a national issue which has been building for a very long time.
What I find interesting, when you've got an opponent, you try and frame them. And so Labor, as soon as Peter Dutton became the opposition leader, it tried to frame him as sort of Officer Plod, as nothing but a former cop turned politician. Is he up to the job of being Prime Minister? He's a hard man, he's a tough man. All of that framing, they barely mention it now. Given how much crime is front and centre, Labor do not want to refer to all of those things that they used to brand Peter Dutton with as some sort of deficiency, because I think in voters' minds, these are actually a benefit.
Well, particularly Peter Dutton has been able to talk about his personal experience in intervening as a policeman in terrible domestic violence situations. He has for months, for more than a year, talked about the need for a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in the Northern Territory. And the latest figures demonstrate that while homicides over the last 30 years, the rate of homicide in Australia has halved, it has gone up in Indigenous. If you are Indigenous, as Anthony Albanese himself pointed out, you are 7 times more likely to be the victim or a perpetrator of a homicide in Australia now. And Peter Dutton has been talking about this all the way through. And now when domestic violence, violence in Alice Springs, problems in Queensland all come to the fore, it is actually to Peter Dutton's benefit. There is no wonder the government doesn't talk about him being the policeman on the beat any longer.
Just quickly on the budget, we had the Treasurer out today with the Finance Minister doing a bit of an early sell of the budget, which will come down not tomorrow, but tomorrow week on Tuesday night here on Sky News, of course. Let's have a listen.
This budget will take a responsible, sensible and a balanced approach. It will be an inflation-fighting and future-making budget. There will be cost of living help for people doing it tough. There will be key investments in a future made in Australia. And all of that will be underpinned by the responsible economic management, which has been a hallmark of this Albanese government.
We've got reports, Dennis, government spending is accelerating in the budget. Deficits are forecast to widen over the next 4 years as a result. We had a former RBA governor, Phil Lowe, out there alongside a whole lot of economists saying he thinks interest rates could still rise. Lots of concern about inflation. This makes it very hard for this to be a vote-buying budget, the sort of budget that Labor generally loves.
Well, indeed, and what Jim Chalmers is trying to talk about is a new model for growth. He has been talking about this for quite some time, saying that he has to help with cost of living, but also the big thing is about investments in Western Sydney. $14 billion there. What we're seeing is a concentration on trying to get growth through spending, government spending, but also trying to attract private investment. But so far, the future made in Australia has not taken off, and all it has done has got warnings from the OECD and everyone else that spending is still going to be a problem with inflation, and this is still becoming the real problem for the government. There is still a danger of an interest rate rise in the next change of interest rates, not an interest rate cut.
The weak response, Dennis, on another topic, the weak response from the Federal Minister who oversees the tertiary education sector, Jason Clare. We've seen all of those university protests. They're not just pro-Palestinian protests, they're anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic protests. He doesn't seem to want to do anything about it. I mean, his seat in Western Sydney, I'll say again, is over 30% Muslim. That might be why he's pulling his punches, but he bucked past everything over recent days to university vice-chancellors, said it's a problem for them. They're wringing their hands, they're not doing much at all. There's a story today about a whole group of rabbis who met with the Prime Minister, and when they pushed the Prime Minister on this university protest, he said, oh, they're just all trots, they're ignorant of Middle East history, but he's not doing anything proactively on campuses to reassure Jewish students about their safety. Jewish MP, we know him well, Liberal Julian Leeser, he says, look, we've got to have a judicial inquiry. You know, not a parliamentary inquiry. Let's get in a respected judge to look into what's happening on these campuses, because you're basically going to send a whole generation of Jewish students away from the university sector if this keeps going.
Well, I think that Julian Leeser is obviously very genuine and sincere in what he wants to do. I think a judicial inquiry or royal commission is probably too much. I think what we need to do is have the government actually take some responsibility on decisions, actually trying to say we'll make a decision and force some of the vice-chancellors into implementing what are already existing laws and protections for people who are obviously feeling frightened. What we are now seeing is a refusal. So why the silence from Clare then, Dennis? Well, Jason Clare's remark that somehow from the river to the sea could be interpreted differently was an absurd, puerile argument to suggest that something which we all know means the annihilation of Israel and the removal of Israel as a state, to try and suggest it meant something else. I mean, everything can be taken differently and different interpretations, but when there is one main interpretation, then that is what you do in a political sense. And Clare really, as we've seen the Prime Minister today say, yes, it was a mistake. Well, yet another mistake made by somebody that the Prime Minister is not making take responsibility. I think that there is a dangerous element on campuses at the moment, but it has, again, been a very long build. And what we are seeing is the build-up of this through all sorts of social, a lack of social cohesion, attacks, public protests, threats. Bill Shorten mentioned the other day about people coming into Melbourne University asking people to stand in favour of Gaza, and if they didn't stand, they had their photographs taken. This is totalitarian behaviour. It's threatening, and it's taking place on our campuses now, and I think action needs to be taken now, not excuses made by the relevant minister, and I think the Prime Minister needs to act. Another area where the government is refusing to take responsibility and pushing decisions, pushing the blame off onto unnamed public servants or people who are not elected. It's time the government stood up on this issue as well as so many other issues.
We speak with Clout, Dennis Shanahan, thank you. Right, as we've just discussed, that backlash in the poll when it comes to crime and national security, not just against state governments, but against federal Labor. For all their promises, Labor's vulnerable in this area. Lots of policy failures, ministerial incompetence, all of it's causing them damage. Today, it was clear that it's getting under the Prime Minister's skin.
Do you accept, though, that the board is only there to provide advice to the government and ultimately the decision is one for the minister?
No. What did the High Court case say? Politicians shouldn't be able to make decisions which are punitive. That is what the basis of this is.
But in the end, though,
that is what... No, I've answered your question.
Have you at least asked your minister to get a hurry on with the preventative detention regime 5 months after it was announced?
Well, it's a lot quicker than what occurred under the former government.
Have you asked your minister?
It is a lot quicker. You don't get a different answer by yelling it louder.
Nasty elbow, isn't it? I'm joined now by Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson. Senator, thank you for your time. Since this attack against Nanette Simons, allegedly at the hands of a released detainee, we've had another man from this cohort charged with theft, charged with threatening police with a knife. Well, he also got bail, this one in Melbourne. Another former detainee also given bail again after further breaches of curfew. Now, why on earth are we not locking these foreign criminals up? The government's got all the powers. Why aren't they using them?
You're right, Peter, and there is no good explanation for that. It's now almost 6 months since the Parliament gave the government these powers and they've failed to use them. It's no wonder the Prime Minister's grumpy, though, because in just a couple of days he's been contradicted by 2 of his ministers. On Friday, he said the decisions of the Community Protection Board are independent. Well, the Minister for Immigration contradicted him in a statement and said it wasn't decisions, it's only advice. And today the Minister for Home Affairs has contradicted him and said they're not actually independent. So there's really only 2 options here. Either the Prime Minister is grossly ignorant of the way in which this system operates, or he is knowingly lying. And a rare credit from me to Clare O'Neil and Andrew Giles, at least they are not willing to lie to the public about their portfolios in the way that the Prime Minister is apparently comfortable doing.
Yeah, but Andrew Giles doesn't have a lot on his desk, mate. I mean, he's set in the Parliament, the biggest job he's got after these 150 foreign criminals were let out was to look after Australians. He swore he would keep Australians safe. So he only has to make, at best, 150 decisions about would-be bail or ankle bracelets. Now, sure, he gets advice from his Community Protection Board, fair enough. But it should be on his desk, not on the desk of a faceless bureaucrat down in the department. That's what I'm cranky about. I think that's what most Australians are cranky about. Why are we paying him nearly $400,000 a year to be the minister if he can't even turn up and take these tough decisions?
That's spot on, Peter. And to make it even worse, the Migration Act is very clear here. The decision maker is the minister. The minister does have the power to choose to delegate that to someone in his department, but legally he's the decision maker. And we know that in case of some of these 153 applicants, he was the decision maker because the Border Force Commissioner, Michael Outram, admitted that to me in Senate estimates in February. Now, since that time, he has delegated this, but that's a decision that he makes. And ultimately, he is responsible for everything that happens in his portfolio. And as you say, this is 153 people. These are not hard decisions. This is, should they be subject to a curfew? Should they wear an ankle bracelet? And I can't imagine why the answer shouldn't be yes to both of those things. And yet the minister in the system he has set up has allowed them out in the community, in some cases without ankle bracelets, as you say, to then go on and allegedly offend against elderly women in our community. It is an utter disgrace.
If you were the minister, would you make the decision or would you delegate it?
Of course I would. I mean, we are elected to take responsibility. We are elected to make decisions. If I have the legal responsibility under the Act to make decisions, I will take those decisions.
I've got to ask you about some breaking news that has just come in, if I can, Senator Patterson. A Chinese fighter jet, this has been reported, has dropped flares in front of an Australian Navy helicopter in international waters. Apparently it happened on Saturday evening off the coast of South Korea. It could have been catastrophic if it wasn't for the reflexes of the Australian pilot. Richard Marles has now called this unacceptable, but we're only finding out about it now, of course. And this comes after that sonar pulse incident last year, and real questions about what action the Prime Minister took with his Chinese counterpart, and in that case also a delay in us finding out. How concerned are you with this report?
I'm very concerned. HMAS Hobart was in the Yellow Sea enforcing United Nations sanctions against the North Korean government. They were in international waters, not in China's waters, and the People's Liberation Army Air Force has taken an extremely dangerous, coercive step here and put the lives, again, of Australian serving personnel in danger. This should not be allowed to happen, and the Australian government must be incredibly robust in our response. I want to know what the Prime Minister has done about this, because last time he abrogated his responsibility to our men and women in uniform by failing to raise it directly with Xi Jinping when he had the opportunity. Have they convened the National Security Committee of Cabinet? What representations have been made to the Chinese government, and at what level?
What do you make of those comments to former head of the US Office of Naval Intelligence, Michael Studeman? He says he has a concern that China's stockpiling. He thinks something is coming over the horizon. He points to rapidly expanding reserves of oil, iron ore, copper, zinc, rare earths, etc. He says a storm from Beijing is heading towards Taiwan. I mean, he's concerned. Are we concerned, or should we be concerned?
We need to take warnings like this very seriously, as well as others that have been made by the US Indo-Pacific Commander, Admiral Aquilino, by our Ambassador to Washington DC, Kevin Rudd, who've all said that conflict in our region is foreseeable in just the next few years. And Xi Jinping himself has said that he is willing to use force to annex Taiwan and subsume them into the People's Republic of China. And he's also right now building the military he needs to achieve that aim. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is going to be war imminently, but we have to be prepared for the possibility of conflict, because it would be utterly detrimental, obviously, to the people of Taiwan, but also Australia and our interest in the region. And our interest is the maintenance of the peaceful status quo. That's the rationale for AUKUS. That's why we're trying to invest in deterrence to contribute to the prevention of conflict in our region. And yet what that requires is a government that understands the seriousness of the moment we're in and is willing to invest accordingly. And we haven't seen that yet from this government.
Now, I remind people, Senator Patterson, of course, everything's on the long finger. It's 10 years down in terms of the budget cycle, not in the immediate budget 4-year estimates. Thank you for your time, Senator. After the break, despite 2 years in a de-radicalisation program, a 16-year-old boy took to the streets with a knife before being shot dead by police. We have got to get serious about assessing these programs. I do not think many work. I'll show you the evidence after the break. Plus, a bit later on, concerns mounting in the UK as a number of pro-Palestinian candidates get up there in the weekend elections, which spells disaster for the Tories at the national election. Welcome back. Still to come, those UK elections over the weekend, very relevant for the upcoming UK general election, but also very relevant for Australia. But first, following on from the stabbing of Bishop Emmanuel, allegedly by a radicalised teen, and the subsequent arrests, police claim, of course, all linked to a terror cell around the bishop's alleged attacker. There was another attack over the weekend, this time in WA, and involving yet another young man. Now, at this stage, you heard me at the top of the show, police are reluctant to label the stabbing of a man over the weekend as a terror incident, but nonetheless confirmed that the teenager who was shot dead was radicalised, despite taking part for 2 years in a supposed de-radicalisation program. For more on this, I'm joined now by the Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Michael Shoebridge. Michael, thank you for your time. Of course, more's going to come out in relation to this attack, but what's clear, what's really concerning me now is that these young people are the ones being radicalised. It takes me back to the time when I was working for Prime Minister Abbott in and around Islamic State. The ramifications, particularly for young teenage boys, are huge. How much do you think this is related to or linked to these anti-Israel protests we're seeing?
Well, Peter, I think there's a direct link. When you see the angry, hate-filled protests on our streets and in our universities, chanting Hamas propaganda slogans like "from the river to the sea," that's all about the obliteration of the country of Israel and the killing of Israelis, removing them from the map. Hamas showed they meant what they say. They did that on the 7th of October. And setting a new ground floor in our community of this anger and outrage directed against Jewish people and Israelis, that means it's an easier step to violence. So we've seen violence now, Islamist extremist violence, in Sydney and now in Perth. There's a direct link.
It's reported that the kid in Perth at 16 had been in a de-radicalisation program since he was 14. He only ever had a phone that could just text, given how concerned they were that he was absolutely indoctrinated. But, you know, here we are, 2 years of a program that clearly went nowhere. I've noted this before, but the London Bridge terror attacker, well, he had undergone de-radicalisation in prison. They let him out saying that he was cured. Well, he wasn't. And around the same time, there was a House of Lords review that found 95% of these de-radicalisation programs were ineffective. Now, Labor Minister Anne Ali, she worked in this area before she went into Parliament. She's out there today saying these programs work. She wants them to stay funded. They should go ahead. Give us your sense about, you know, how effective you think they are.
Well, the evidence shows us they don't work. This young man, it's a tragedy that he's dead and that he stabbed someone. His family and the community and the police are all suffering because of his radical violence. But he clearly wasn't de-radicalised. You know, he allegedly texted friends saying he was on the path to jihad and then stabbed someone. So if de-radicalisation was working, it hasn't worked for him. And as you say, it didn't work for other people in the UK. So the evidence we have is de-radicalisation isn't working. And I think the level of anger and outrage we're seeing on our streets is a failure of leadership. Just like the Prime Minister failed on the Voice referendum, he's failed to lead the public conversation around the war in the Middle East.
Well, let's just move a little bit to the side. It's still related. These protests on university campuses, the federal opposition says police should go in and break up these encampments. We've seen that happen in the United States. They are even arguing we should be fining the universities. Well, the universities, broadly speaking, have washed their hands. I mean, my day at university, you drop litter and you could use points and you could have your degree withheld, and it was pretty tough at Melbourne Uni in those days. Now it looks like anything goes. Do you think we need this sort of action?
Well, you get punished for using wrong gender language on a lot of these campuses, but using hate-filled slogans like "from the river to the sea" is apparently okay and they can't do anything. I don't believe them. Rather than sending the police in and kind of stoking violence there, I think your reference is right. Universities can suspend students, stop them going to classes. Universities can stop students from graduating. If they're using these hate-filled slogans, that's what universities should be made to do. It's working in some US universities.
I was just talking to James Patterson about the stuff that's just broken now in relation to flares going off in international waters from a Chinese aircraft in front of one of our naval helicopters. It takes us back, obviously, to what happened with that sonar incident and you know, a weak response we got at that time from the Prime Minister. But Xi Jinping's about to land in Europe. This is his first overseas trip to Europe in 5 years. What's this about?
This is about the Chinese economy being weak and needing the European market. Xi knows that the EU, and France is leading this in the EU, wants to end the Chinese ability to flood its car market with cheap Chinese electric vehicles and kill the European car industry. And she's turning up to say, please don't do that. And if you do, I'm going to slap tariffs on brandy and cognac from France. Does that sound familiar to Australian wine drinkers?
Thank you very much. You just explained that very, very simply and effectively. Michael Shoebridge, thank you as always. All right, just before we go to a break, another update in the ongoing defamation case brought by Senator Linda Reynolds against Brittany Higgins. Reynolds has filed to have the details of a trust set up by Higgins to be made public. Reynolds asserts this trust was established to protect the $2.4 million that Higgins received in that Commonwealth taxpayer payout, going as far as to allege it was intended by setting up the trust by Higgins to defraud future creditors. Now, if this claim is successful, Senator Reynolds would be able to access any and all assets held by Higgins through this trust, including, of course, that payout. All right, how the pro-Palestinian issue has loomed large in UK elections over the weekend, with a record number of anti-Israel candidates getting elected, and what this might mean not just for Rishi Sunak, but Australia. Plus, taxpayers who've never gone to university just bailed out those that do, to the tune of over billions and billions of dollars. Now, is that fair? My panel weighs in next. Welcome back. Still to come, the plan to dump nuclear waste from our submarines here in Australia. Well, that pours cold water surely over all those arguments against nuclear power waste. But first, a devastating weekend for the Tories and the Rishi Sunak leadership as the Conservatives suffered heavy swings to Labor in local council elections. Now, Britain, as you may or may not be aware, doesn't have anything like our state governments. It's got big local councils and then a national government, so two layers of government, which is why these results are at a local council level are such an important insight into what's ahead for the Tories. Indeed, analysis says that if these results were to be replicated, well, the Sunak government would be shown the door in a landslide for the first time in 14 years. For more on this, I'm joined by former Victorian Liberal MP Tim Smith, live from London. Well, Tim, it's hard to underestimate, isn't it, the scale of what happened in the UK over the weekend, and also the number of pro-Palestinian candidates elected. I'll play a grab from one of them in a moment, but just in broad terms, how damaging is this for the Tories?
The local election results held in England on Thursday were a catastrophe for the Conservative Party. Andy Street, the very popular mayor of the West Midlands, lost, and that really showed how much trouble the Conservatives are in, because Andy Street was universally respected, very popular. The West Midlands is around Birmingham. There was a by-election as well on Thursday in Blackpool, and the Tories suffered a 30% swing against them. So basically the Tories' vote is somewhere in the mid-20s. Now, that is end of days stuff. So the Tories and Rishi Sunak are in so much trouble that I actually think his leadership is safe because, for one, 60-odd MPs aren't recontesting this election. There's about 50 who know they're going to lose anyway. And Suella Braverman came out yesterday in quite extraordinary interview and said that she regrets supporting Rishi Sunak, but he has to take the Tories to the election, and that they've got really no alternative. They have to get in behind the Prime Minister to try and save the furniture.
I mentioned those pro-Palestinian candidates. I want to play a comment, pretty shocking scenes from one Greens Party candidate. Have a listen.
Be silent. We will raise the voice of Gaza. We will raise the voice of Palestine. Allahu Akbar.
Allah Akbar in the UK. We've just gone through a democratic election, and that's the result.
Yeah, that was a councillor up in Leeds, I believe. To concentrate on one of the bigger councils, so in the West Midlands, for example, the candidate that came third, Ahmed Yaqub, he ran on a purely anti-Zionist platform and got 11% of the vote. So Labor here has actually got quite a big issue with hemorrhaging votes to George Galloway on their left on the Gaza issue. So this is going to be quite interesting, the way this plays out for the general election for the Labor Party here. In a first-past-the-post system, you've got Tories hemorrhaging massive amounts of votes to Reform, that's Nigel Farage's crowd on the right, and Labor potentially hemorrhaging votes on the left to pro-Gaza anti-Zionist candidates backed by George Galloway. So that's going to be quite an interesting dynamic going forward for this general election. But if I could just focus on the Reform issue for a moment, Andy Street in the West Midlands lost by 1,500 votes. 34,000 people voted for Reform. The Tories are going to get, if Nigel Farage returns to frontline politics, and that's a big if, but if he does, heaven help the Tories, particularly in the north of England.
What do you make of these reports that the Tories think they're so far gone, they can't salvage Rishi Sunak? This goes to the line from Braverman that you've just got to back him in, let him lose, let him, take the show out with him, and that Boris Johnson would join with Nigel Farage to basically reboot, rebuild centre-right politics in the UK under a wholly new banner?
I don't think it would be under a wholly new banner. I think it would be under the Conservative banner. And it really depends on what Nigel does regarding this election. If Nigel sits this election out, which is what he's currently suggesting, and returns to frontline politics after the election, potentially rejoining the Conservative Party, remembering Nigel was a member of the Conservative Party in the 1980s, then that would obviously be a dramatic reset in centre-right politics in the United Kingdom. Obviously, there are many Tories who are completely opposed to the idea of this. And if you think about the Liberal Party in Australia being a broad church, well, there are 350 Tory MPs in Westminster at the moment. I suspect there'll be far fewer after the next election. But the Tory party is a massive broad church, and at least a half of it would think the idea of Nigel Farage returning to the Conservative Party as total anathema. So watch this space, Peter. I think the next year in British, particularly Conservative politics, is going to be absolutely fascinating.
Or terrifying, depending on your viewpoint. Tim Smith, thank you. That was great analysis. See you soon. All right, after the break, taxpayers now on the hook for billions of dollars as Anthony Albanese moves to wipe out student debt, plus even more trouble for the over-budget and much delayed Snowy 2.0. More on that shortly. Right, let's bring in the panel. Keith Pitt and the wonderful Gary Hargrave. Gents, I tripped over that one there. Let's start with education.
Well done.
Labor has unveiled plans yesterday. They're going to wipe $3 billion from the HECS debt. I declare I was the first year of uni in 1990 to pay the HECS debt. So I speak from someone with experience. It's a pain in the posterior, but I've always thought I get a good education out of it. I should be paying something. That's not the view of everybody. If you've got a bachelor degree, you will earn more over your lifetime than someone, say like my dad, he didn't have a bachelor degree. Now I sort of think, why should the tradie paying tax fund the university student that extra $3 billion? Is that fair, Keith?
Oh, Peter, I paid it too. I paid it up front. I was fortunate enough to have some money in savings. It was a silly decision, actually. I should have taken the government's tick. But let's call this for what it is. The Albanese government's cricket team of media spinners have been out telling everyone with a HECS debt that their HECS debt's going down. It's not going down. It's still increasing. Yeah. It's just the rate of the increase. The indexation is not as high as it would be otherwise. And the reason it's so extraordinarily high is the Albanese government can't get inflation under control. But credit where it's due, Peter. That's right. Jason Clare is onto something when it comes to pracs. Social work, for example, I had a look today. You do a 17-week prac, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And for all of that for free. And on top of that, you get a HECS bill for that subject for $9,000. And I don't think social work pays all that extraordinarily well. I think the system's broken and it does need to be reviewed and fixed.
Yeah, I do agree with that. But I mean, we used to put nurses into hospitals to learn to be a nurse. Then we took them out of hospitals. Absolutely. Now we're going to basically pay them to do that work again. I mean, nothing's new. And what about that loophole today we find out in those draft AUKUS laws, if we can, Gary, that we are going to take the nuclear waste from subs out of the UK and US and store them here in Australia? Now, I don't have an issue with that. We've got the land mass to do all of that. But this is one of the arguments that Labor has against nuclear power. Well, what about the waste, they say? Well, if we can store the waste from submarines, surely we can store the waste from nuclear power here with the same principle.
Yeah, I understand the general rule of thumb is if you make it, you take it. So if you make the waste, you take the waste. But look, you know, you're right. And these nuclear submarines are all going to be in themselves little nuclear reactors, and they're going to be bobbing around our coastline, going to be visiting our various port cities. They're going to be made in Adelaide. There was that plan to have that Kimber, that town along the air highway, set aside, but the Indigenous owners balked at that, and that was at least a plan to deal with storage. Look, the Albanese government can't be in both camps. They're either going to be all for AUKUS or against the concept of AUKUS. If AUKUS starts to bring in nuclear power in the form of floating nuclear power stations, then we should be also considering nuclear power stations terrestrially, in other words, on the ground, and we also need to have a plan for the waste. If we make it, we've got to take it. We have to deal with it. But, Peter, we're only talking about small amounts, because what comes out of even a nuclear power station is relatively then reused, recycled, repurposed, and nuclear medicine, things that give us x-rays and other procedures, That just doesn't come from a bush in the backyard. It has to come from somewhere, and it's good for Australia.
Yeah.
Keith, what the heck's going on with Snowy 2.0? This is the Turnbull boondoggle. It was going to cost us $2 billion. It's up around 12. Apparently, we had another issue with Florence, I think her name is. The tunnel borer got stuck again. What's going on?
Peter, it is a Malcolm special. But I'm advised that Florence is still moving. It's about 6 metres a day in very, very hard rock. And I saw the reports of a miscalculation in terms of blast and drilling that went into the nearby chamber and did a fair bit of damage. I think we're still waiting to see reports on what that will cost as an extra. But I'm still thankful that there are people in Australia willing to do this work. They're doing everything they can to keep them safe. There's no reports of injury, which I think is good news. But this is what happens. It was untested. They were uncertain of the cost, and now we know the cost is blowing out by an extraordinary number. This is what happens when you want to rely on intermittent wind and solar, Peter.
Jens, I've got to leave it there. Truth, as always, at the end. Thank you for your time. That's it for me. See you tomorrow night. Here's Andrew.